Well, folks, I'm very happy to have Dr. Califf with me again on Healthcare Unfiltered. I appreciate in advance the time that he is going to give us today on this podcast, talking about Dr. Califf. We can agree it's a contentious topic, the accelerated approval pathway, where I just told him before we went on the air that I don't envy his position because it is impossible to please everyone. But I appreciate taking the time. This is the second time we taped this together. The first time we talked about drug shortages, it was extremely informative. Got a lot of feedback. Folks really appreciate the information that you provided. So thank you for giving us another podcast.
You bet. It's my pleasure.
We have to give just a quick 1 minute background about the guest, although this is the second time. Just a little bit about your background. The reason this may be important is because the FDA and you deal with everything, not just oncology. I'm a cancer specialist, but you deal with cardiology, oncology, rheumatology, everything, especially as you go with new therapies and accelerated approvals. So how big is your team? How do you rely on the other specialties that you may not be as familiar with as others? And a little bit about your background and how you got the job.
Well, I'm a cardiologist, but gosh, over 35 years as an intensivist with a big outpatient clinic. But my the way I really got going was I came along just when we figured out what caused heart attacks. We got into treating a lot of patients in a very busy cardiac care unit, and it was pretty clear that we didn't know what to do exactly. And we had a lot of computer capabilities at Duke early on before most people did. So we became a big coordinating center to do clinical trials and figure out what was effective. And, you know, most things we tried didn't work, but some of them did, and they became very important, like thrombolytic therapy and then the use of stents and beta blockers and ACE inhibitors for heart attacks, the various anticoagulants. We did clinical trials and all of those. And that led to a belief that every area of medicine should be using similar methods. And we developed a research institute that eventually dealt with 17 different institutes at the NIH, and everything from primary care to anesthesiology, and including oncology. The American College of Surgeons Oncology Group was located at our Clinical Research Institute. So all that work led to a lot of interaction with FDA, and I think that's what led to my being offered the job to come and join FDA originally in 2015 as a civil servant for the first year, and then President Obama asked me to be commissioner. And then this time around, President Biden asked again. So here I am again.
And I'm going to assume there are days in your life where you regret that position.
Well, I've always been someone who loved to absorb information, and it's definitely the case here because, I mean, you mentioned it, there are 18,000 people that work at the FDA now, and remember that medical products is only half of what we do. The F in FDA stands for food. And, the most undersold part of FDA is the Center for Veterinary Medicine. You think about precision oncology in people, imagine precision medicine for 3,000 species, ranging from giraffes to fruit flies. So we have a very broad spectrum to deal with. And of course, we're part of Health and Human Services, which is the entire public health apparatus of the U.S. government. So I interact a lot with NIH. We've got one of your fellow oncologists, Dr. Bertinoli, now as the head of the NIH.
Yeah.
Very exciting. A lot of work with CDC. So I'm very dependent on other people, but I always have been because I've done in intensive care. It's all about the team, right? The team has to work together, and you have to develop trust and reliability across the team. And in global clinical trials, you're dealing with multiple countries and hundreds of research sites. So I highly value the capabilities of colleagues. And what could be better than Dr. Pazder in oncology leading the FDA oncology branch? And that is a really super group of people.
Well, I absolutely think that the FDA deals with a lot of things, and as you said earlier, sometimes it's just impossible to please everyone because there's always folks that will contend any decision that you make, and it's just the name of the game. And with all of the work that you're doing, I hope you get some time to rest at the end of the year. We're taping this towards the end of 2023. We're going to air it early January, so I certainly hope you'll get some rest, but not before we finish this podcast, which is a topic that's really gets a lot of attention. The accelerated approval pathway of the FDA. And we'll go into some of the controversies and some of why folks, you have some naysayers to the accelerated pathways and you have some big supports. But maybe it's a good idea to start a little bit of a background to the extent you'd like to share. When did this start and why did it start, this accelerated approval pathway from a regulatory standpoint for the FDA?
Well, the real there's been a tension throughout history in this question of access to treatments that might be effective versus proof that the treatments are effective. And so I think the big moments in the U.S. were, first of all, 1962, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which came about because of thalidomide. And that was the part of the law that set the requirement that you had to prove that a drug was effective. Before that time, if doctors said it was good, it was assumed to be effective, which, among many other things, doctors were promoting different brands of cigarettes at the time. Yeah. And so thalidomide really made the point that you've got to understand the risks and benefits of a drug. Then later, the Dalcon Shield happened with devices, and we ended up with similar but not identical regulations related to devices. But then HIV/AIDS hit us, and many people were dying. It was a very activist community. Tony Fauci was very involved, as many people know, and it would have taken a long time to measure the outcomes with the treatments that were available. And so the idea of using biomarkers or preliminary surrogate endpoints became a key part of the law. So that was, 1990s. And the idea is if there's a disease that is life-threatening for which there's not an effective treatment, it's sort of in the American psyche and culture to want earlier access and take greater risk in that situation. And so Congress acted on what people wanted by passing laws that put these various accelerated pathways into effect. And they're depending on how you count it, 4 or so different pathways, but they all have in common the idea that you would accept evidence which leads to reasonable likelihood that the benefits outweigh the risk. Most often for the most part, I call them biomarkers or unvalidated surrogates. Because if there's a surrogate, let's say, for example, LDL cholesterol or systolic blood pressure, that's validated, then that actually leads to full approval if you make it on the surrogate. And so accelerated pathways put a lot of trust in the FDA employees who are full-time civil servants. Remember that I'm a political appointee, so I don't make decisions about approval of drugs or devices. That's done by full-time civil servants because they have to weigh the evidence where the standard is high for the evidence that you have, but it's not the same as clinical outcome evidence. And over the years, a number of amendments have been made to the fundamental legislation. And the last point I want to make about this is I think it's best to think of the FDA as it relates to medical products. We are referees. In other words, we have to make decisions on the playing field as it's happening. And we have a rule book that we go by, which is something that's a set of laws that are passed by the U.S. Congress. We don't make the rules, but like any good set of referees, given the basic rule book, we do have a role to play in terms of interpreting the tough cases in between where the rules are not specific. And of course, we have input to Congress, so-called technical assistance when they are making the rule book. But basically, we're referees. We are not the accelerated approval is not something the FDA created. It's based on a set of laws that were created by a process between voters, advocacy groups, with input from FDA.
But the idea was pretty much is let's try to provide faster access to drugs in scenarios where probably there are not a lot of options. I mean, just conceptually.
Right. Life-threatening diseases for which there's no known effective treatment.
So if I'm thinking, are there of requirements, if I'm a company want to apply with a drug for accelerated approval, are there like 1, 2, 3, 4, I need to check the box? What are these requirements I need to?
It's basically, basically what I said. You have to have a life-threatening condition. There has to not be a clearly effective
Therapies.
treatment. And there are a few other things, or does it fit into other pathways like orphan drugs or other categories? But it's relatively straightforward. But like an example that makes it complicated is you have a common disease like let's say lung cancer. As oncology is getting better at segmenting different subpopulations, one can make the case that there might be categories of lung cancer that fit in. Even after there's a general treatment that's good, there may be specific situations where it qualifies. That's where, again, the judgment of the FDA becomes very important.
You mentioned the surrogate endpoints, and I think it's probably an understatement to say that this is probably the most contentious part of, not, I can't say the most, one of the very contentious parts of as you look at certain things. And Dr. Califf, you mentioned it's unvalidated, which I appreciate because that's usually the contentious piece. I can honestly, if I was on a debate stage, I can argue pro and con surrogate endpoints. As we all know, because like in anything, there's always the pluses and minuses. I think the biggest criticism that I hear is exactly what you said, that these are not validated. So when you get a surrogate endpoint, let's say response rate in a cancer drug or progression-free survival, that this may not always really translate into true clinical benefit that matters to patients. So how do we resolve this issue? In terms of the surrogate endpoints that are being used? Are there specific surrogate endpoints you think should be used more than others? Like, what do we do with this problem?
Well, the law says reasonably likely, and that's in the judgment of full-time civil servants who have no financial interest in the outcome, but obviously we all care about patients. And I in one phase of my career, I spent a lot of time on decision analysis and patient preferences. And when you're feeling fine and you're making a statement about what criteria should be, and you're not affected by the disease, often you feel very differently than you do if you actually have the disease
100%.
and you're seriously ill. So I think people that have the disease and families have spoken and Congress has acted. So if we want to change it, Congress will have to pass laws. And frankly, I think with the exception of a couple of things that were recently tweaked, I think the public has been pretty good with the way it currently works. Now, we are referees, and I just finished a week of watching a lot of football and basketball. Referees don't always make the right call.
Yeah.
And there is more uncertainty in an accelerated approval because an unvalidated surrogate may or may not end up working out in the long run, and there's judgment involved. So I'm not saying the FDA always gets it right, but I think the current set point, at least in my view, is pretty good. And since everything that we do is public and it's amenable to study by experts who want to analyze it and maybe suggest changes in the rule book. You know, I saw a lot of charge block calls in basketball over the last week. And uh, when you begin to see a lot of calls that are going on one side or the other, then the officials and the leaders take a look at it and the coaches and say, maybe we need to make an adjustment here for this. That's always going to be the case.
I appreciate you mentioning that it's much easier to opine on something when you are not affected yourself or your family members. It reminds me of addressing code status. I mean, obviously, it is much easier to withhold therapy and say we're done with treatment when it's not really you or your relative or your loved ones. When it's you or somebody else, it's really more challenging. It's just the human nature and just the way it is.
Oh yeah, I once participated in a clinical trial called the support trial, where we took people who were within 6 months of end of life and randomized the intensive care units, either getting very detailed information from nurse practitioners who were specially trained to sort of break the news about what it meant to be resuscitated or not resuscitated. The view of a lot of people going into it was you have all these people who don't really know, and they don't agree to DNR status because they just didn't have the facts, which are, the odds are against you in that situation, as you well know. But when we did the randomized trial, it turned out it didn't change anything. When people,
Yeah.
a lot of people, even if you say the odds are against you, they say, well, maybe I'll be that one. And so these things are complicated. We don't always get it right. Our calls are not always right, but um, I think the American people, by and large, if they're critically ill with no effective treatment, would like to take more supervised risks than waiting on all the studies to get done.
And I think the supervised risk that you are referring to, if I may, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the post-marketing confirmatory trials. These are, there is in the law, there is that, if we grant you accelerated approval, then you must conduct confirmatory trials so we could be convinced that there is true benefit. There's a lot to unpack here. I guess number one, is the FDA involved back and forth with the manufacturer in the design of the confirmatory trial? Do you have a say into it where you say, okay, this is the type of study that you need to do for us to grant you the full approval? Or is this, they just do the trial and submit? Is there a dialogue
Oh
going
no,
on?
there's a lot of back and forth, and I think one of the things that it frustrates me sometimes that we haven't gotten the message across to a lot of people about is throughout the entire process of drug development, there's a lot of back and forth. A lot of people have commented, well, now if you look at applications, the vast majority are approved, those that apply for approval. But what's not said is that 90% of drugs that are entered into phase one never make it to market because they drop out of the race well before anyone would submit a final application. So in all that back and forth during drug development, most things fail. It's a big advance, I think, to have earlier failures so that you don't end up with people put on experimental protocols for drugs that aren't going to work anyway. And you don't have manufacturers spending a fortune on late stage clinical trials and applications that aren't going to succeed. So there's a lot of interaction. And a big part of the interaction that occurs as you get ready for that final submission is a discussion on what should the follow-up trial be. And that will continue until the protocol is set. So yes, the FDA has a lot of input into that.
And then the confirmatory trial is done, and there are one of two possibilities. One possibility is it confirms the clinical benefit. The other possibility, it doesn't. If it does, it's an easy thing. Obviously, you get the full approval and everybody is happy and you pleased everyone. I think the problem is if it doesn't, and I was reading in preparation for this several articles on this. It's not easy for you guys to withdraw the drug from the market. It is. I mean, I was reading an article written by Daniel Aaron, who is a lawyer at Harvard, and he wrote an editorial in JAMA on the FDA struggle to withdraw McKenna. And I was really, I felt bad because in preparation, I mean, there was a lot back and forth. You had to prepare 241 documents, hearing 3 days, and despite all of the votes in favor of withdrawing, the manufacturer still appealed, and it's going to court. And I mean, that's not an easy task. Tell me about this. I mean, how challenging is this?
Thanks for acknowledging this, but it's not limited to this. We live in a country where we believe that people have a right to appeal decisions that are made by the government. And so let's just take vaping products that we come across in international ports. Every time we confiscate a product, we have to go to court. And we only have a certain number of lawyers, and it's very time consuming, and we have a limited budget. So the stress of this is significant. What I will also add, though, is in the most recent update to our laws, this was an adjustment of the rules. We got more authority now to remove a product if we think it's the right thing to do. But I should also point out, I only wish that it was always a binary, clear yes or no confirmatory trial. There are results which are in a gray zone. Let's say it seems to work in one subgroup but not another. There are times when the trials don't get finished. And, having been a trialist for most of my career myself, in theory, you say, well, you just do a confirmatory trial. But let's say you had a child with a disease that was uniformly fatal and you had an accelerated approval. Would you want that child to go into a placebo-controlled trial with survival as the outcome? These things are not easy. So it's something that we need to continue to work on and figure out the best methods. But there are a lot of results in between definitively yes and definitively no.
I think a lot of folks the argument is always that psychologically you always want to go into the actual treatment. The problem is we can't guarantee that the treatment doesn't cause harm. Essentially we're hoping for a clinical benefit, but realistically we have to agree that similarly there could be harm more than benefit because we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is for sure, worse than a treatment that doesn't work is having, and knowing it is promising a person that the treatment will have benefit when it actually doesn't. So these things, I think in these kinds of situations, it's very different. I'm a cardiologist who dealt mostly with coronary disease and heart failure, where we have a bunch of effective treatments already. So we're always offering the patient something. But in these situations, it's tougher. And I'm actually not uncomfortable about the arguments that go on because I don't think we know exactly the right answer. I think, as I say, I think we have a good rule book right now, but we'll have to keep adjusting it as we learn.
I mean, in one of the articles I read, they were saying that the median time to withdrawal from the time that the company might have a negative confirmatory trial is 4 years. That was one of the articles I read, and that seems astonishingly too long because during those 4 years, many patients could continue receiving that treatment that may be ineffective or potentially harmful.
Yeah, I think the point's well taken. That's why we were so much in favor of the adjustment in the law that gives us more authority when this situation comes up. But you saw with McKenna, and we're seeing it with menthol cigarettes right now. There are surprising numbers of people who will defend these situations and feel very adamant about it, that the FDA has it wrong and they have knowledge that should supersede the FDA. So we live in a tough environment, but we signed up for the job.
And Dr. Califf, when we talk about the adjustment of the law, that's a good segue for some of the legislative changes. Are you referring to the FDA, the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, the FDORA? That was maybe that's an opportunity to explain what that is to viewers and listeners, because it's good to have more authority and kind of arm to enforce some of these things.
Every 5 years we have user fees that are agreed to between the FDA and the industry. Just philosophically, I wish we didn't have user fees. I wish the taxpayer footed the bill and we only reported to the taxpayer, but that's not the way it works. And the user fees are actually adjudicated by a congressional act. The patient advocacy groups have a say. The public health groups have a say. And along with the user fees, there are all sorts of adjustments, tweaks made to the law that governs FDA activities. And so, but even beyond that, throughout the course of the year, there are opportunities to put an adjustment in that's helpful. So very recently, we've gotten this additional authority to go ahead and withdraw drugs that are proven to be ineffective or where the company doesn't get the trial done, and more explicit authority to make sure that the right trial designs are done. And that won't be the last adjustment. We'll keep learning.
Is like you said, there's always the courts that everybody could take anything to the court. If the company refuses to abide, you only have the legislation, right? You just basically, if it keeps, the contention continues, there's only the opportunity to just resolve this in courts. I mean, that's how it works.
Well, I'm very worried about that right now. So up until the last couple of years, what I would say is, yes, they always have the right to appeal to the courts, but traditionally the courts yield to the FDA as a science-based agency. Judges are obviously not scientists and not trained to adjudicate clinical outcome data or biomarker data to make these kinds of decisions. So usually it's only a matter of the FDA violated a procedure. It's a sort of a technical issue. But recently, more judges have stepped in and, I don't know, acted like they were FDA. And I'm worried about that, because if we end up with every decision of FDA ending up with a judge potentially overruling the FDA, would be extremely disruptive to the entire system.
Yeah. We'll go back a little bit to the surrogate endpoints because I have a couple of questions I forgot to ask. But one of the things that are important is, I mean, obviously, the FDA is a United States agency, so you don't have jurisdiction technically over what the company would do outside of the USA. Needless to say, though, our decisions here do affect, to an extent, some of the decisions that occur outside of the USA. And one of the examples is there are certain drugs like atezolizumab that was withdrawn from the market here in the US for bladder cancer, but was for breast cancer, but was continued to use globally in India and on other locations. And the manufacturer was contending that they just go by the authorities in the local communities, and somehow the local community in India was continuing to use this drug. What are your thoughts when we actually have a negative confirmatory trial here that shows conclusively there's no benefit, but the drug continues to be used in non-US countries? I recognize you can't force the non-use, but it seems, I don't know, I was disturbed when I read that.
Well, I think you should be disturbed, and it's disturbing, but we also have to accept that we have countries for a reason with jurisdiction of their own affairs. And so, I think we can all envision a day when drug and device development is done in a transparent way around the world that leads to data sets that can reside in the cloud that academic journals, academicians, and regulatory agencies can access the data according to a set of rules, very much in the cloud environment. It's made for that. And so you could have, let's say, the Indian authorities and the US FDA looking at the same data set, but we may make different decisions because our cultural values may differ and our settings of clinical care may differ. Um,
I mean,
over
the other
time,
problem is that you end up almost mandating to have trials in every country because, I mean, I'm a firm believer that there is a environmental factors, occupational factors. There are certain elements that maybe the disease could be different between two countries. Maybe I can't prove it, but if you open that Pandora's box, then you're almost needing to have a study in Asia, study in Europe, study in the US, and that's impossible.
well, before you say it's impossible, I don't necessarily agree because even though the disease may be essentially, I mean, let's just take the disease I'm most expert in, coronary disease, and let's look at India. If you look at India, there is a big population of people with very few risk factors and who are thin, but who have very diffuse coronary disease. And, we're learning more about what's involved in that. But it's also the case, if we take something like a coronary stent, there was a time in India where the cost of a surgery was less than the cost of putting in a coronary stent. And so you end up with these interactions of the clinical care system that become important. And when we look at it from a US perspective, we're constantly focused on diversity of clinical trials, right? And we want a representative US population. But put yourself in India or Singapore, where we started a medical school. Would you want all the drugs to be developed in the US with US patients, and then we just assume that's going to work in India or Singapore? So I would argue that over time, we need to develop a distributed clinical trial system that's global. And we need to learn using advanced statistical techniques and methods of reducing the cost of clinical trials to get larger sample sizes. I mean, after all, when you think about precision medicine is built on a comparison of you as an individual with a population to see how you fit in with regard to how you might respond to an intervention. So you need a population that represents something akin to you in order to draw that extrapolation. But
Yeah.
those are further thoughts.
So one of the things in cancer that we usually go by is the NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines, and oftentimes it's much easier to put things on the guidelines than taking them out. And this has been actually proven by evidence. A couple of people have written about it that get a drug in the accelerated approval, and it gets on the guidelines, you lose the approval. It's so difficult to actually take them out, so difficult to change the prescribing patterns. What's the intersection between the FDA and the NCCN if this happens? Is there an actual dialogue, or is this?
Well, this is where I think in the U.S., cancer is privileged in a way by having Dr. Pazder leading this really astute. I mean, if you go to the grand rounds at the FDA, no offense to any academic centers out there, but I would say it's better than most academic centers in terms of the intellectual content. And there's a lot of interaction with the guidelines. And so I think it is productive, but there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, remember, there are a lot of generic drugs, cancer drugs, where the guidelines aren't even represented in the label of the drug because the label was written for a previous time. And I know Dr. Pazder has a code name for every project. There's one on this topic. In most areas of medicine, this just doesn't exist. We're working right now in the area of stimulants for ADHD. There aren't actually aren't even any guidelines for adults, and that's where the biggest increase in prescribing is occurring. So this brings to mind something I wanted to say about the follow-up studies. I think the very most important thing right now is we need across the board in the US to revamp our post-market evidence generation system. And most of that is not in FDA's lane. We have a role to play, for example, with these accelerated approval drugs, but there's so many questions left on the table after FDA approval. It's interesting today, across my email came a study from Friends of Cancer Research showing that indeed the dose of the oncology drugs needs to be adjusted after approval as more studies are done. But right now, we don't have a highly efficient or effective post-market evidence generation system, yet we all have, if we're patients, we have something at stake in getting these answers like, what is the right dose? How long should we give the treatment? How do the treatments compare? The comparative effectiveness question. What's the value of the treatment? And of course, now with the IRA, CMS has a major interest that didn't exist before in getting the answers to these questions as they go to evaluate how to negotiate price. But again, this is not FDA's primary area. We have a role to play. But now with a new NIH director who's an expert in clinical trials and the changes in CMS, this would be a chance for us all to work together. You and I were talking, I have a relative with pancreatic cancer right now. The question is, should you get your adjuvant, your chemotherapy before or after the operation? That's a pretty big question. There's not been a clinical trial on it.
Yeah.
That's a shame.
But could the FDA be more picky with the surrogate endpoints, Dr. Califf? I mean, there's a recent example is the Alzheimer's drug, the aducanumab, and there's so much thousands of articles probably written about this in terms of I think wouldn't that be within your jurisdiction in terms of saying, look, this surrogate endpoint we're not going to take because we just don't think it's really clinically meaningful. Is this something that you could possibly look into?
We look into it all the time, and there, you know who, but there are a lot of people that are constantly analyzing the decisions that we make. Unfortunately, one part of it that I wish could change, when we say, no, we're not going to consider this surrogate, often the company goes out of business. And there is no record. There is no, it's a proprietary, confidential interaction that occurs by law. It's not that we want it to be that way. That's what the law tells us we have to do. So you don't have a record of all the things that we turn down. I'm not talking about turning down once the clinical trial is done, because with clinicaltrials.gov, you've got to register your clinical trial. I'm talking about in the development process, a company comes in and says, serum porcelain is a great biomarker for our disease. And we say, no, it's not. So we're not going to consider that as a valid approach. There is no that's a proprietary interaction between FDA and a company that's guided by US law. So we do that all the time. And, again, you can disagree with the call that we made. Was it a charge or was it a block? Was the player offsides or not? That's a big one that happened last week. And we don't always get it right. And we within the FDA, you'll find different opinions, but we are vested with a responsibility. I used to run intensive care units. I had to make decisions every day about critically ill people where you couldn't wait for everything to get in place. You had to make your best judgment. And that's something we have to live with.
So there was I forgot, maybe last year I was asked to debate for one of the journals to debate something about accelerated approval, to think a little bit provocatively. So I'm going to give you a thought, and I don't know if we're pressed on time, but this will take just a few minutes. Because one of the things I was thinking about is, let's say you get the accelerated approval, and let's theoretically say there's 5 years between accelerated approval and the confirmatory trial. And I'm going to just throw theoretically, my company made $1 billion a year in total sales for these 5 years. So I made $5 billion in sales. And then the confirmatory trial is negative. why can't I, because it's negative, pay back the US government, I don't know, 20%, 25%, like a pre-negotiated rate, because technically I generated so much revenue for a drug that eventually proved not clinically helpful. Don't I owe the taxpayers or somebody? It was a thought experiment I was thinking about. And I don't know, is this crazy thing to even consider?
I, I don't think it's crazy. I think there's some real practical issues with that particular proposal, but a similar proposal would be that the price of the drug be less during that
Mhm.
period when you're not sure, when you're doing the
Right.
confirmatory trial. Um, I I personally think that's a good idea. There are many people that think it's a terrible idea, but again, that's not the FDA's call. We don't have anything to do with the pricing of medical products. That's a responsibility of the other part of the system. So someone may ask us what we think for technical assistance, but it's not something that we can decide, or we're actually prohibited from considering price in our decisions.
Can you share with viewers or listeners like some of the success stories of the accelerated approval? Like, I mean, as you look back, something that, you know, they can look back and say, this actually did help
Well,
patients.
it starts with the original HIV drugs, which were approved based on, viral load biomarkers before they were fully um, um, confirmed. And then you go to Gleevec. That's a pretty good one. Would it have been a good thing to wait an extra 2 or 3 years, which has been
No.
said to be the, um, I had a personal experience. I was sitting right at this desk. My mom had multiple myeloma. She had been through several treatment courses, and her oncologist called and said, "We tried everything. It's time for hospice." And, she was in her 80s at the time. And I said, "Well, um, she's had a good life. I understand. Let me just call Dr. Pazder and see if there's anything new." And he said, "That's amazing that you called, because we just approved daratumumab for refractory multiple myeloma for accelerated approval based on a single arm trial. And it looks pretty good." So my mom tried it. She got an extra 3 or 4 years of a pretty good life after that. So I'm not saying that to say that that means that I think every decision that we make or every accelerated approval is good, but I do have a little personal um, experience here. But to come back to this post-market phase, I mean, another factor that I think is very important is, where is the clinical community in this? In other words, if the treatment's unproven, um, there ought to be cognizance of that in the clinical community, and there should be a real commitment to get the follow-up trials done. I just had a few months ago, I had an interesting experience with AHIP, the Insurance Plans of America, where they were on my case. Why doesn't the FDA get these follow-up trials done? And my question was, what are you doing to get the follow-up trials done? The biggest thing I hear from clinicians is they're under constant pressure to see more patients in less time, and they don't have time to participate in the trials. What if the insurance industry got behind this and made it easier for clinicians to participate with their patients in clinical trials, and put pressure on the companies? The clinicians should do that um, to get the evidence. And then if the evidence is positive, then and the treatment really works, let's make sure people get it.
It is
If it
much
doesn't,
easier,
let's
much,
stop it.
much easier to point fingers and much more difficult to find solutions and be proactive about it. What's next? I mean, we talked about the legislative process, the new laws where you have more arms. If we're having this conversation, 2, 3 years from now, where do you see this conversation would be going? Are you optimistic? Some of the changes, I guess, if you had all the power in the world to make changes, what are these changes you'll make? And I don't know, whatever you think the future holds for the accelerated approval pathway.
Okay, I know we're short on time, so I'll be brief here. And what I'll say is I'm always optimistic I mean, there's always more that we can do. I would say the FDA is the least of our problems. Everywhere I go in the world, people envy the innovation of the American system, the fact that we're constantly generating the ideas and products themselves and drugs, devices, biologics. We're number one in the world in this. We're in the top position, but our implementation of these products and our post-market evidence generation system, we're spending $4.3 trillion for the worst longevity of any high-income country. And so we've got to fix this post-market system. And in the ideal world, we would use the power of our 340 million electronic health records to constantly surveil clinical practice and embed randomized trials at a very low cost, where it would give us the evidence we need in the post-market phase. And we would really emphasize giving the treatments that are effective and get rid of the things that are ineffective as a way of doing healthcare. And we're very far from that now. But I also want to point out the most exciting scientific area where I have no idea how we're going to deal with it, but it's going to be really interesting to work it out. You know, gene editing, we had our first approval for sickle cell disease of CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. This is only the beginning. And for rare genetic diseases where you have a tiny population, you know, what should the evidence level be in those situations? How do we get the trials done? How do we bring in the global population? Because if it's rare in a 340 million people like the US, if we had all 8 billion people, you know, so I think areas like that, both the science of how do we understand off-target effects of gene editing, how do we segment populations, and then how do we get trials done and assess the evidence? That's the biggest other new thing besides fixing the post-market system.
Thank you so much for actually taking time of your busy schedule. Really appreciate it. Wish you a beautiful holiday season, and I wish your relative speedy recovery. We will stay optimistic.
Thanks very much. Take care.